Let me tell you a story. It's an old story, 2,600 years old, but it's a true story. And as people of faith, it's part of our story. In the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the nation of Israel was at war, invaded by the mighty empire of Babylon. And in that war, Israel was defeated badly. The walls of Jerusalem were torn down. The people of Israel were removed from their homes, uprooted from the land that they understood was God's promise to them. They were dragged off to live under the thumb of the Babylonians. The very last sight they saw as they left was the temple in Jerusalem being torn down piece by piece. The temple, the center of worship, and in the Hebrew imagination, the very dwelling place of God, was turned to rubble. Their beautiful city lay in ruins. The people were forced into exile. Decades went by, a long time, a lifetime or more, some have reckoned. The Jewish people, they languished in their captivity. They blamed themselves for turning away from God and for bringing this disaster upon themselves. Long before they were carried away in exile, their prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah too, had tried to warn them, and now they wished they had listened. They cried out to God, but when no relief came, they wondered if God had left them altogether. They prayed for a vengeance, for God to intervene and heap retribution on their enemies. They also never gave up their yearning to go home. And then in the year 540 BCE, something remarkable happened. It came in the form of another king, a warrior named Cyrus the Great from an unknown land named Persia, moved across the landscape, gathering armies and acquiring territory. His rise to power was swift, and soon his armies were at the gates of Babylon. And it wasn't long before that ancient and mighty empire was brought low. The people of Israel saw God's hand at work in the victory of Cyrus the Great, and they rejoiced. Vengeance was finally at hand, they believed, and they relished the thought of it. Now was the time when God would finally give their captors a taste of their own bitter medicine. Cyrus would wreak havoc on Babylon the same way that the Babylonian king had destroyed Israel. But that's not what happened. Cyrus did not fulfill the people's appetite for retribution. He did not crush Babylon. Instead, this ruler did something far more astonishing and inexplicable and unexpected. When Cyrus captured the king of Babylon, he treated him honorably. And when the king's wife suddenly died, Cyrus's own son conducted the funeral. When the armies entered Babylonian cities, some of them surrendered without any fighting at all. And in turn, Cyrus granted amnesty to all the soldiers. Surprisingly, Cyrus then set out to right the wrongs of the past. He released the Jewish people from their captivity, and he sent them home. He allowed them to return to Jerusalem. He encouraged them to rebuild the city. He knew nothing of their Jewish faith, but he urged them to rebuild the temple on the same site where it had been destroyed. And then he went further. According to the ancient historian Josephus, Cyrus had an inventory made of all of the precious vessels that Babylon had pillaged from the temple. He added them up, wrote them down, and then he gave them back. He sent the people home with their bags full. And then the record shows Cyrus sent his own treasurer to Jerusalem to watch over the construction and to contribute financially to the temple's restoration out of Cyrus's own coffers. Josephus says that the funds Cyrus gave contributed to building the foundation and the altars, its polished wood and its precious stones. And then when everything was finished, Cyrus himself sent an offering to be sacrificed in the temple according to the laws of Moses. He asked for prayers for himself and his family and for the well-being of the kingdom. In light of all this, it isn't really a surprise that Cyrus is mentioned by name 23 times in Hebrew scripture in glowing terms. And he's alluded to many more times than that. And perhaps it's really not any wonder then that when the gospel writers reached for language to try to explain Jesus, they sometimes drew on words that were originally used to describe Cyrus. All that's to say that it's into this context that the prophet Isaiah cries, "Comfort, comfort my people." It's not a command, it's an announcement. Comfort is coming. Comfort is here. It's an exclamation of astonishment, as if to say, comfort, can you believe it? And you can imagine the people of Israel might very well have said, no, not really. Because when the news you've heard has been bad for so long, good news sounds very strange. It's hard to believe anything that wonderful can possibly be true. Having been wounded, they didn't know how to trust tenderness. Having been held captive for a lifetime in Babylon, they had forgotten what freedom felt like. Having had their voices suppressed for so long, they no longer knew how to sing with joy. But Isaiah the prophet, he had not forgotten. The preacher Samuel Wells imagines a conversation between Israel and Isaiah, a dialogue, a duet of sorts that sounds something like this. Israel recognizes it was their wrongdoing that caused their estrangement from God. It's what had gotten them into this mess in the first place. But God says to Isaiah, "Cry to Jerusalem that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid." In other words, all sins are forgiven, and the consequences are now healed, so it's time to put it behind you and pack your bags. But then Israel presents another obstacle in the way of accepting God's comfort. Oh, it's such a long way, a 30 days journey to get back home, and in between there are mountains and valleys and all sorts of challenging terrain. So Isaiah sings, "Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain." In other words, don't go worrying about the road back. A herald is going ahead of you to clear the traffic from routes 36 and 25 all the way to Zion. But then Israel confesses, "We just don't have the strength. You know how the grass withers and the flower fades. That's what we're like. We've been discouraged for so long, and we're tired." And Isaiah agrees. Yes, the grass withers, the flower fades, but you need to remember that the word of our God will stand forever. In other words, you're not going to take this journey on your own strength. You're going to do it on God's strength. To borrow words from later in the same chapter, God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. But still, there's one more obstacle. And this one seems to be the biggest one of all. The last one is about fear. Isn't that what it always comes down to? But yet Isaiah says, yes, I get it. It's a fearsome thing to step out on faith and to look at God. But when you summon the courage to lift your eyes, you are in for a big surprise. Behold your God. You will see that God is mighty, of course. God has just overcome our weakness, flattened the mountains and the valleys, and forgiven all the damage done. But it turns out that when we look more closely at this burly warrior, the one who has just defeated Babylon, he's really a shepherd who just wants to scoop you up and hold you gently against his chest and speak tenderness to you. Behold your God. That's how Isaiah announces to Israel that the exile is over. Here is reconciliation and freedom. Here is level ground, a smooth highway that leads to home. Here there is a song of joy, and yes, finally, there is comfort. The words of Isaiah remind me of another story. This one's also true. The Christmas truce of World War I. Maybe you know the story too. One commentator called the event every general's nightmare and every pastor's dream. On December 24th, 1914, in Flanders, in the middle of a Belgian forest, German and British troops faced off against each other in a frontline battle. Each side had dug deep trenches down into the ground to protect themselves against the other's artillery. Day after day, they fired at one another with just 70 or 80 yards between them in some places. And then on Christmas Eve, young German soldiers, longing for home and missing Christmas, took the extra candles they had in their supplies and they fixed them to the trees in the woods. When the British soldiers looked through their rifle sights, they wondered what they were looking at, until someone said, "Christmas trees." Then, across the mist, a German soldier began singing. Everyone hushed as the sound of his rich baritone came to them across the mist. The song was Stille Nacht, silent night. Soon the sky was filled with the sounds of a bilingual choir. No shells were fired that night. At dawn on Christmas Day, some German soldiers emerged from their trenches and approached the Allied lines across no man's land, calling out, "Merry Christmas," in English. At first, the Allied soldiers feared it was a trick, but seeing the Germans unarmed, they climbed out of their trenches too, and they shook hands with their enemies. Along the tops of the trenches, soldiers began posting signboards that read, "You no fight, we no fight." As each side waited for a response, more placards on both sides popped up. And soon up and down the line, men were laying down their rifles, lifting themselves over the top of the ditch and walking out into the middle where they met one another. They brought gifts to exchange, jars of jam and chocolate bars, newspapers and postcards, whiskey and beer. By noon on Christmas Day, a group of British and German soldiers were playing soccer together. Others played cards. Someone pulled out a harmonica and another a violin, and they sang the carols they knew by heart. They helped each other recover bodies from no man's land, and together they buried their dead. Christmas overwhelmed all orders to shoot. One young British soldier wrote this to his mother in a letter. First thing this morning, it was very foggy. A few of us that were lucky could go to Holy Communion this morning. It was celebrated in a ruined farm about 500 yards behind us. I, unfortunately, couldn't go. But there must have been something in the spirit of Christmas today as we are all on top of our trenches running about, whereas other days we would have to keep our heads down for the bullets flying. We had a few Germans over to see us this morning. We sang with them. We sang, "O come, all ye faithful," and while shepherds watched their flocks by night. We sang together. Just before dinner, I had the pleasure of shaking hands with several German soldiers. A party of them came halfway over to us, so some of us went out to meet them. I exchanged one of my helmets for a German hat. I've also got a brass button from one of their uniforms. We exchanged smokes and we had a decent chat. They say they won't fire tomorrow if we won't. So I suppose we shall get a bit of a holiday. It all seems so strange, but after a fashion, we have enjoyed our Christmas. With much love, from your boy. 35 years ago, the singer-songwriter John McCutcheon wrote a ballad that tells the story of Christmas in the trenches. One summer, when he was at a music festival in Denmark, he noticed a group of old men who entered the room every time he played. They always arrived late, and because all the seats were taken, they stood up right near the stage and they watched silently. They were always the first to leave. On the last day of the festival, they were there again, and as they were leaving, John jumped off the stage and caught one of them just before he was out the door. The man explained that he and his friends had traveled from Germany to Denmark because of the song. Their friends and their family didn't believe them, but they wanted to hear the song because they were there when it had happened. At the center of Isaiah's words lies this promise. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. The glory of the Lord, it turns out, is a mighty warrior setting his weapons down to lift a lamb to his chest. It is tenderness itself. It's the end of exile, and it's the journey home on a smooth highway. It's a construction crew lifting a temple wall back into place and rebuilding the life of a community. It's an unarmed soldier stepping over the ditch into no man's land, lifting mountains of fear, lowering mountains of violence, trusting the tidings of Christmas cheer he carries in his empty hands and his open heart. All eyes were on him. It must have been hard to believe it was happening, but all flesh saw him together. And on that Christmas Eve, when the mouth of the Lord was opened, the voice that was heard was surely one of the most astonishing sounds that has ever been heard. It was comfort itself. It was beauty. It was peace. And it is coming to us again, even now.